Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host, I'm your moderator, and I'm also the creator and the publisher of thechocolatelife.com. Today's topic is going to be fact-checking. Why is fact-checking important? And more importantly, today I'm going to be talking about fact-checking me to begin with. Right? Because I think, again, it's really important topic to discuss. Before we jump into today's topic, I'd like to remind everybody, go into the live chat replay if you're watching on YouTube or the comments on LinkedIn or Facebook. Go and let me know where in the world you are connecting from. I'll get that shout out up on screen. And then if you have any comments or questions, things you'd like to ask me, you can get those up on into the chat as well. And I will get them acknowledge them, get them up on screen and answer the questions to the best I can. And if I can't answer them during the episode, I will get answers to them and put them on the post for today's episode. And with that, just a quick reminder for people who might be new here that this is the homepage of the Chocolate Life right now. This episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode, is sponsored by the members of the Chocolate Life. So go and become a member. There's always a free tier. If you do have the resources to be able to support the work that I'm doing financially, it's always appreciated. But click on the join button and you become a member today. Start living La Vida Coco, as I say. And then for every single episode of Pod Save Chocolate, I put together a dedicated post. And this is the post for today's episode. And one of the things I do is I put together links so that if in the future, if you're coming to this later, you'll notice that I have versions of it on 3 different platforms, so YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. But also there are links to resources that I'm going to be posting in here, so you don't actually have to follow along and worry about the URLs when if you are able to watch this on a large screen and you can have 2 windows up, you'll be able to follow along and see what it is that I'm talking about. But also, if you want to go and review any of these things later, you can go and review all of this stuff later. And today, that's all I have to say before I begin. What I want to talk about today is this notion of fact-checking. So I have always tried really, really hard over the course of the more than 23 years that I've been writing out about chocolate to get my facts straight. And one of the reasons why is that once something gets out there on the internet and starts to get broadly distributed, not that I'm saying that my stuff is, broadly, that necessarily broadly distributed, it begins to take on a life of its own. And what you'll do is you'll find people citing articles that have been debunked in the past. And yet it's really, really difficult to go back after the fact and update them and say, hey, this is not the way things really are. We need to be really, really careful about that because things have a tendency to take on a life of their own. And we need to be aware of that fact. And then just generally, sort of out of an intellectual curiosity, I like to be right. I'd like to know that what I think in my brain and what it is that I'm talking about are in fact correct. It's simple. It's as simple as that. And so I want to tell a story before I go into the details of this and what caused me to start thinking about this. And that is, I had the opportunity. I was participating in an online forum, and I was talking about the fact that I was very, very proud about having come up with a term, having coined a term, a portmanteau, which was intertwingled, which is a combination of intertwine and intermingle. And I posted it without really thinking about what that meant, right? And as a result of feedback from other people, I decided, you know what, I'm just going to go look up. Did I come up with the term intertwingle? And it turns out that I didn't. And it turns out that it's been around for at least 50 years. It's been around since the early 1970s that I'm aware of. But as a result of that, I went down this, deep sort of memory hole, this deep memory lane, rabbit trail of, sets of associations that let me know that, I know where the connection is. I know where I first encountered the term, but I'm not entirely sure how I memory hold it, how I came to believe that I was the one who came up with it. But in any event, there is a term, and it is intertwingularity. And it was coined by Ted Nelson. So people may know of Ted Nelson through something called Project Xanadu, which was a very, very large hypermedia system. It used a really, really interesting technique, which is called transclusion. There's lots of really interesting insights into what Ted wanted to do in Project Xanadu. And he's also the person who coined the term hypertext, hypermedia, and hyperlink. I mean, he's the person who coined them. And those go back to the early to mid 1960s, whereas intertwingularity might be early 1970s. But in any event, Ted is also the author of two books, one of which is called Computer Lib, Computer Dreams, and another book is called Literary Machines. And my father had both of those books in his home office library when I was an early teen. And why would my father have these books on his library shelf? Well, he was at Stanford University in the late 1950s. I was maybe a year old when he took this job. And while there, he met a guy by the name of Doug Engelbart. I don't believe Doug was on the staff at Stanford. He might have been at SRI Scientific. I don't remember exactly, but Doug was working on a project called Augment for the ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which became DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And Doug was working on computer-based systems for information management that we would now think of today as hypertext. He was working to develop a system which was based on an idea first posed by Vannevar Bush, B-U-S-H, who was a science advisor, a presidential science advisor. There was an article that he wrote, I believe it was in 1937, it was published in the Atlantic Monthly, called As We May Think. And in that article, Bush said he wanted to create this thing called a MEMEX, which is short for memory extender, right? Which would be a way of organizing and accessing all of human knowledge. And it was based on microfiche. I mean, it wasn't feasible, in the technology of the 1937. But as we started getting large computers with lots of storage, beginning in the late 1950s, the idea of implementing a MEMEX became feasible. And Augment was one of the earliest projects to try to implement a MEMEX. And then Ted Nelson was inspired by that work to start working on Project Xanadu, right? And which led to, again, the coining of the terms hypertext, hypermedia, hyperlink, and this term intertwingularity, right? Or intertwingle, right? So intertwingularity talks about the interconnectedness of everything, that it's impossible to completely divorce one topic or concept from another topic or concept. Everything in human knowledge is intertwingled, intermined and intertwined and intermingled. So for me, it's a fabulous term. And it turns out that, not only did my father have these books on his shelves when I was a young teen, I would have read them, and that's where this concept probably entered my brain, right? And I have this distinct memory, right, of actually becoming conscious of it and consciously inventing this term for the first time. Right. And it turns out I probably didn't invent it for the first time. It's something I remembered, but it had been so long ago, I didn't remember that I already knew the term. Right. And, so having made this public assertion that I had coined the term, it occurred to me to think, did I in fact coin the term? Now, just a couple of things. Number one, Douglas Engelbart, I may have mentioned, is the inventor of the computer mouse. If I haven't, he is the inventor of the computer mouse. Ted Nelson, as I've mentioned, is the people. I had the great good fortune in an earlier career to meet both of these people. I was involved in a consulting gig for a firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the late 1980s. And it turns out that Ted was associated with the company that I was consulting for. And so I had a chance to, which is why I think I can call him Ted as opposed to Theodore. I sit there, I was like, I had that personal connection. And I do remember having conversations with Ted around the work that inspired Project Xanadu. My father's connection to it through Doug Engelbart. And then just 4 or 5 years later, I joined a software startup looking to implement many of the ideas in the original Vannevar Bush Memex on personal computers. So it was highly influential in my life. And I thought, well, in early 1990s, 1993, 1994, if I recall correctly, I would have had a chance to go and meet Doug Engelbart in his office at Logitech in the Bay Area. And so all of this is connected. Everything about this thing is intertwingled, right? Which is really, really quite lovely when I went back and thinking about it. And so that's one of the values and one of the bits of importance around fact checking, right? Is if you take the task seriously of wanting to understand, right, what you're talking about and what you present. Right. So, I come across, as a subject matter expert. I've just been doing this for a long time. I have a lot of experience doing this. I work very, very hard to make sure that I present things correctly, but memory is fallible. And if you're not careful, you have a memory of things, right? And it turns out your memory is incorrect. I mean, another example of that is, I talk about my journey, right? I talk about my journey and what it is that I wanted to do when I first started publishing chocolatefile.com. And I realized that I needed a rating and reviewing system, which was different from the way wine was rated and reviewed. I didn't want a strict numerical system. I wanted something different. But then, over time, I came to this realization that one of the things that chocolate needed that it didn't have at the time, this was late 1990s, early 2000s, was that there needed to be a genre of literary criticism around chocolate, which didn't exist at the time. And I now am not sure when I came up with that idea. Did I come up with that idea prior to starting publishing chocolatefile.com? Or was it something that grew, over time? And I no longer remember exactly when that thought came to me. It could be a retrojection. It could be something I came to 2 years later, 5 years later, 10 years later. I don't know the answer to that question. I might have had an intuitive sense that it was required, but I don't necessarily know that I articulated it very, very clearly until much, much later. And I've been telling the story about me and my chocolate life, and it turns out that it may not be entirely true. And as somebody who wants to try to tell the truth, and as somebody who is interested in getting their facts correct, and telling my story properly, it turns out that all of these things are really, really important to me, right? And that is some of the journey that I've been going on in over the course of the last week. So what is it that triggered all of this? And so what triggered all of this is 4 years ago or so, I published this article on the chocolate life. It's linked to from today's post. You can go and read it. I have updated it. I haven't edited it. So I added some updated information in the cards, but I did not edit the original post in any way. And what I said is that somebody came to me about 10 days ago and said, listen, I have an objection to some of the things you say about a post that I made. Right. And so here's the title of the post is, can you trust the internet for chocolate information? So people who know me know that when I do my monthly news roundups, I'm very, very careful about pointing out where does one of the articles that I'm talking about, does it cite primary sources? Can you go and learn where the person who's writing about this got their information? And so, can you trust the internet for chocolate information? And so I did this original post, I had this, and it said, okay, there's this guy who wrote a story. I forget, he's actually called the History Guy. And the History Guy did a post called The Forgotten History of Chocolate Candy. And I like this guy. Right. I think his style is really, really approachable. I like the topics that he talks about. The way that they are presented brings me in. I just enjoy watching them. But he did this one post, which is the Forgotten History of Chocolate. And I said, okay, there are some things in this post that I think are incorrect. Right. And the whole purpose of this post was, what I did is I entreated people who were reading it to go and watch these posts and say, hey, Clay, I think these things are mistakes. I think these are incorrect. These are things which I, as somebody who knows something about the topic of chocolate, would say, here's somebody who's a storyteller who may not be a subject matter expert in chocolate, might have got some things wrong, right? And if you know me and the things that I've been writing on the Chocolate Life, the things I've been doing with the Chocolate Life Live and Pod Save Chocolate, I'm all about wanting to get to these sources. And so I really did leave it up as a task for the reader, a task for the listener to go in and, we could start a dialogue about, was this true or was this not true, right? And so there are three things on the internet in general, one of which is this history guy. And as I say, I generally like this guy. I have no reason to believe that he's being disingenuous. I mean, I think he does his good research and he's talking about things to the best of his knowledge, right? But this is 4 years ago. I haven't looked at this in the last week. I don't remember specifically what I thought were points that I would take issue with in this, right? But as a subject matter expert, I call myself a subject matter expert. One of the things that I know is that when I run into a post like this or a video like this, and they present quote unquote facts, which may or may not be factual, what it does is it calls into question everything else that they do. Oh, this guy got this wrong. I'm not a subject matter expert on something else he's doing. Can I trust everything that he says right now that I know that he made mistakes on his chocolate article? And that's, I think, originally what inspired me to do this particular post, right? Another one is this guy here, Dr. Gus, right? Did an article about the chocolate, the health benefits of chocolate. And there were some things he said in there, again, I took issue with. And then I did some research on Dr. Gus and his background. Is he a licensed physician? Is he a licensed physician in what state? What is he licensed to do? Can he make the claims that he's making credibly as a medical professional? I mean, these are things that, I looked into and I talk a little bit about after having done the research. Right. And so the third thing that I talked about was a TED Talk video. I haven't linked to the audio of it. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but not a TED Talk, a TED Ed video, all right, on the history of chocolate, right, by a medical historian by the name of Deanna Pucciarelli. And again, after 4 years, right, this is the one. So I got an email from Ms. Pucciarelli. She said, listen, I think, I think you made a mistake in labeling anything that I posted in this article as being factually incorrect, right? And we had a back and forth and said, listen, I may have made a mistake. Let me go review the video. I'm happy to tell you what I thought some of the mistakes were. And if you'd like to provide me with primary source material that says I'm wrong, I'm happy to change my position and make a public retraction and say everything, that is, wrong. And after 4 years, I went back and looked at it. And I could say, well, maybe there are 2 things or 3 things that, I can quibble with. There are some issues associated with timeline that I'm not, would take hours and hours and hours and hours to go and research. And so I'm willing to let them go. But there were 2 things that stood out as being factually incorrect. And, the email thread, the correspondence back and forth, basically, Ms. Pucciarelli said she was not interested in engaging in that dialogue with me, and all good, right? But what I did was, in my update to this, I said, hey, here's what's going on. I was approached, and what I did is I then did another post, the importance of fact checking, right, which is a members only post. So if you want to read the whole thing, you need to be a member, right? In which I did refer back to this. So it's a little recursive in terms of what's going on. But I started talking about, my thoughts about some of the things that were in the post. And what I wanted to do today was I wanted to go over, I did a fair amount of research, and I wanted to go over and talk about some things. And I also want to show, for those of you who are not familiar the Chocolate Life, there's now a new footnote feature. So if you come in and you can see, whoops, if I scroll in, zoom in, you can see we now have footnotes. So that's cool. All right. So, let me do that. So the first thing so there were two things that I wanted to talk about, right? That I did a fair amount of research in looking through the TED Ed video, and two claims that were made in the TED Ed video, which strike me as requiring a lot more nuance. And that's where I'm going to spend most of the rest of today's episode talking about. And I haven't put all of these links in the post. I will put more of them in after today's episode ends. But the first one of which is, who invented the cocoa butter press? Now, it turns out that common wisdom will tell you that Conrad van Houten invented and patented the cocoa butter press in 1828, right? And that is wrong. That is wrong. There are many places where it makes that statement outright, right? But there are many places where what they'll do is they'll go, it is wrongly connected to Conrad. It turns out that his father, Casparus. So Casparus, right? So here is the Van Houten website. Van Houten, most of the rights to the Van Houten trademark and brands, all right, are owned by Barry Callebaut. Some of them in Asia and other parts of the world are actually licensed to other people, but the majority of the Van Houten trademarks and brands are owned by the Callebaut, especially in Europe. And here on the Van Houten website, it says right here, right, that Casparus Van Houten, right, invented the hydraulic cocoa press. So I'm looking at this picture here and I'm going, that looks like a 2-roll mill, doesn't look like a cocoa butter press. They're really talking about cocoa powder here. And, what's going on here? But it turns out that, this is, for me, a fairly authoritative source. Here's the company that owns the brand. They're owning the history. They're saying, here's what happened. And it turns out that, the father, Casparus, is the one who invented the cocoa butter press. And then I went and started looking and said, what does that press look like? So here is, so here is the image that we saw, right, on the Van Houten page. Again, this is not a cocoa butter press. It's a 2-roll mill. It might be a 3-roll mill. Oh, you know what this is? This mechanism, I know what this is. This mechanism here is a grinder. Right. So what you'll do is the powder will come into here. It's a plate grinder. It's a horizontal grinder, right? And the stuff comes through, and what it's doing is taking the large particles and putting them into smaller particles, and it's dropping it between the rollers of the roll mill, which is making a finer particle size. So that's what this looks like to me. That's my guess. Right. This is more what a modern vertical cocoa butter press looks like. I don't know if this is actually what it is that Van Houten patented. Apparently, there are no extant drawings from the 1828 patent. There are no drawings which said this is what Van Houten patented at the cocoa butter press. The patent expired in 1838. When other people were building presses. I'm looking at this and, this looks sort of like a patent drawing, right? So, because we have letters associated with different parts of the things. So we have a little hand operated press. There's a hydraulic cylinder. We have a reservoir of fluid. That fluid is going into a piston, and that piston is pushing up against wrapped bags of chocolate liquor. This looks like it'd be really messy. Where is the butter going? No idea. Right. So this might be something that was, reminiscent of the first cocoa butter press. No way of knowing. Right. Because the drawings don't exist anymore. But what we do is we find, again, that the cocoa butter press was patented 1828. Patent expired a decade later. And then we have a lot of people experimenting with how to make hydraulic cocoa butter presses. And then eventually the creation of expeller cocoa butter presses. And it turns out that there is still new innovation which is happening to this day. So if you go to Google, the patents, Google Patents, what you can do is you can find their patents, which are 2 years old, 3 years old, right, which are still working on updates and refinements to these um, um, these particular vertical and horizontal pot presses. You can buy vertical pot presses like this today, brand new. They are manufactured. This is an older system. I mean, layman, right? So here, what looks like what you do is you have a melter for chocolate liquor. It's pumped into the pots, right? It makes an enormous amount of sense to think about it. But the important thing to remember here is that Conrad van Houten, who is normally attributed as the inventor of the cocoa butter press, did not invent the cocoa butter press. It was his father, Kasparis, who invented the cocoa butter press. What Conrad did invent was the process of alkalization, right? Of taking, of adding some sort of alkali to chemically neutralize the acidity. Remember, this is the 1820s, late 1820s, and conching had not been invented yet. So there was no mechanical means to be able to selectively evaporate off volatile aromatic compounds you don't want, right? If you were going to get rid of the acidity left over from fermentation, chemical neutralization was the way it was done. And it turns out that Kasparis' son, Conrad, is the person who invented the process of alkalization. The two are very, very closely related to each other. And as a matter of fact, I mean, in doing research on not just the cocoa butter press, but Dutch processed chocolate and things like that, what we do is we find out late 1820s, right? There is no specific date for the patenting of alkalization. They think that it is 1828, 1829, somewhere around that rate. Could have been the same year, the year later. That these two things are very, very tightly intertwingled, right? And one of the reasons why we may think that Conrad was the inventor of the cocoa butter press is because he is the inventor of alkalization. Now, this article on Dutch processed cocoa is interesting for other reasons, in part because one of the things that you'll often find when people talk about Dutch processing is that Dutch processing does basically destroy 100% of the nutritional value of the cocoa. And there are links to some research who suggest that you can't make a blanket statement about how much of the nutritional value of alkalized cocoa is destroyed during the alkalization process, because, among other things, it depends on how heavily alkalized the cocoa is. If I have a lightly alkalized cocoa, the nutritional content is going to be higher than I have a heavily alkalized cocoa. So if I got a black cocoa, right, like the kind used to make Oreos cookies, it's going to be very, very heavily Dutched, and that's where the color comes from. And it will have a much lower nutritional component than you have something which is very lightly alkalized. And that alkalization depends upon the specific chemical that you're using, the specific base that you're using, what the strength of the base is, and what the contact time is. And so there are lots of factors. So we can't say all alkalization destroys 90% of the nutritional content of cocoa. That's not the way it works. So we need to be a little more nuanced. There are some links to some research here which suggests, we need to be a little more nuanced here. And this is, again, an example of intertwingularity. So I'm looking for who invented the cocoa butter press, got into cocoa alkalization and its effect on the nutritional content. These are topics which are inextricably linked. They are intertwingled in a way that in order to be able to understand part of it, you need to understand a much larger context for what's going on. And for me, this is the fun of what it is. Well, it's not all of the fun, but it is a lot of the fun of what it is that I do. That, there are questions which, seem to be very, very straightforward, which aren't very straightforward. And if you're not careful, you may make broad statements about this is the way things are. And it turns out that you just can't make those categorically broad statements anymore. You need to be more nuanced, right? And, I probably spent 10, 15 hours over the course of the last week, maybe a bit longer, going over these things, reading the sources, reading the links, finding things like, so Dutch cocoa contains 1/3 of the caffeine of natural cocoa. Now, again, I think that is a blanket statement we need to be very careful of. I think it depends on what the alkali is, and again, the concentration and the contact time. But it says that if right, there are statements that get made we need to be careful about, right? Because it may turn out that reality is a lot more complicated than we think it is. And that was just who invented the cocoa butter press. So if you thought that the cocoa butter was impressed by Conrad van Houten, you are wrong, right? The cocoa butter press was invented and patented by his father. Now, there had been no doubt other mechanical, and specifically the hydraulic cocoa butter press, right, was patented. So we need to be so. Were there other attempts to do this in other ways? The answer is probably yes, right? But this particular cocoa butter press, and it's not the only style of cocoa butter press that we use. Again, another style that's used in the modern time is the expeller press. So just to let you know. So that's one of the importance of fact checking. For me, I don't know that I probably would have said that it was Conrad, 3 weeks ago until I got into this. As I recall, when I went back to this post about the TED Ed video, the TED Ed talk video, that I don't recall from the script exactly what I objected to originally. I had to go back and look at it more closely. And so it was this examining assumptions, saying, is my memory of these things correct? I mean, what was I doing? And I'm fact checking myself. And it's important, even if I am somebody who knows more than the average person knows, it's impossible to know everything, and it's impossible to know wrong, and it's possible to know wrong stuff, right? That, you make up a story, and I'll tell you a story that I had made up, right? Which is one of the things that my own sort of myths that I constructed in my own brain, right? That I needed to talk about, right? And so the other thing that I wanted to talk about, again, from this TED Ed video, was around the invention of milk chocolate. And the story that I had invented in my brain was that milk chocolate was invented as a joint venture between Henri Nestle and Daniel Peter. And Henri Nestle, I said to myself, well, he invented powdered milk, didn't he? Didn't Henri Nestle invented powdered milk? And maybe what happened is that Daniel Peter and Henri Nestle got together, and Henri Nestle contributed his patent for powdered milk to Daniel Peter, and they co-invented milk chocolate. And not only that, but what happened is after Milton Hershey purchased all the chocolate making equipment from the Chicago Exposition in 1893, he went to Europe and asked, Henri Nestle, can I, license your powdered milk patent? And Henri Nestle said, no, right? I have this thing going on with Daniel Peter, right? And so Milton Hershey went to the UK and talked with fellow Quakers, the Frys and the Cadburys, and learned how to make chocolate crumb from them, and brought that back into the United States. And it turns out I made that up. I have no idea, how and where and why that whole thing got constructed in my brain. And it might have been, so a misunderstanding of the timing, when did things happen? What was the order of events that things happened? And so if I'm going to talk about the invention of milk chocolate, what I need to do, who invented milk chocolate, I need to ask myself the question, well, who invented powdered milk? Because I was of the assumption that powdered milk, right, was the breakthrough that led to the invention of milk chocolate. And it was just an assumption, right? The Fry family and the Cadbury family in the UK had to come up with the crumb process because, they needed some alternative to powdered milk. And it turns out that Henri Nestle did not invent powdered milk. As a matter of fact, right, I learned from research that the idea of drying milk predates the time of Marco Polo. So Marco Polo writes in one of his books that Tatars had carried with them sun-dried milk. So they sun-dried milk, they would be able to reconstitute it, I guess. And so they could take the milk and it would not go bad, and they could reconstitute it. So they're carrying it. So, but that goes back, at least what, 500 years, 700 years, a long time, right? So the idea of drying milk has been around forever. But powdered milk, right? There are patents going back to the 1820s and the 1830s. And there's a specific mention of a vacuum still, patent a method for vacuum drying milk dated to the 1830s. And so powdered milk as a thing had been around for a while. So if Henri Nestle didn't invent powdered milk, what did he invent? And the answer is he invented a baby formula. Now, the baby formula consisted of cow's milk, right, with wheat and sugar. And the milk and wheat and sugar were processed to make it more digestible. Okay? But how do you keep it shelf stable at a time when there is no easy refrigeration? And so what Nestle did is he figured out a way to be able to remove the water and dry it, right? He did that with the wheat. So the products are called farine lactée for flour, right? Milk, flour milk, farine lactée. And he figured out a way to make it shelf stable by removing the water. So cooking it, maybe using a vacuum, maybe drum or roller drying it, right? That's what Nestle figured out. And he did that in the late 1860s. Right? He started going into production in 1869 or thereabouts. Went from very, very small production to producing millions of units in a very, very short period of time. And that's what Henri Nestle did. He invented this baby formula. So enter Daniel Peter. So Daniel Peter, fellow Swiss gentleman, is trying to figure out how to make milk chocolate. Now, just so you know, the idea of combining milk and chocolate is not new, right? So we have some history going back to the 1680s, I think it is, in the UK, around the start of gentlemen's clubs, where in the UK, what they've done is they've started making hot chocolate using milk rather than water. That appears to be a British invention, not a Spanish invention. And it would have been something that was done in the late 1680s. If, as we learned from World Chocolate Day, that cacao came to Spain in the 1550s, about 100 years later, is when it really started to spread throughout the rest of Europe into the UK. And it would have been one of the gentlemen's clubs, I think specifically White's, if my memory serves me correctly. It's only been a week, but I think it's the White's Club, is where hot chocolate made with milk became very, very popular. So the idea of using milk and chocolate, right, that is something that had been around for a while. Right? But there has been a lot of work saying, how do we add that milk to make a solid chocolate bar? Right? So this is where Henri Nestle, right, his work on doing a compound milk product, not just removing the moisture from milk, but adding ingredients to the milk like sugar and flour, right? And then finding a way to remove all the moisture, this work becomes important. So it appears that Daniel Peter, right, worked with Henri Nestle, or had the assistance of Henri Nestle, to figure out how to take maybe cocoa powder, maybe chocolate liquor, to be able to add it to milk, to be able to add it to sugar, right, and make what we call chocolate crumb, right? And it looks like that is the collaboration which made it happen. So the Henri Nestle technique was apparently to take sweetened condensed milk. So what we're going to do is we're going to take milk, we're going to add a lot of sugar to it. We're going to cook it and remove the moisture, perhaps under vacuum. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add other ingredients, in case the cocoa, either the liquor or the powder, right? And then we're going to continue to cook it and reduce the moisture. And there are advantages to cooking, because what you can do is you can, through the Maillard reaction, is you can continue to develop sort of the caramel flavors that are associated with milk chocolate, just through the process of caramelizing the sweetened condensed milk. Anybody who's made on their own dulce de leche, by taking a can of sweetened condensed milk and putting it in a pressure cooker and just cooking it in the pressure cooker for 20, 30 minutes, you make fabulous dulce de leche that way. It's very, very easy, and it's repeatable. Easy way. But that is what happens. If you take that and then you figure out a way under vacuum specifically to remove the moisture, then you've got chocolate crumb. And that is what. So when we talk about the invention of milk chocolate, what we need to do is we need to go back and say, all right, what is the process by which we add the milk to the chocolate? And it turns out that you learn that Henri Nestle didn't invent powdered milk. As a matter of fact, that technology goes back quite some ways. But it's important to know that the cocoa butter press and alkalization is the late 1820s, and these techniques for drying milk, right, mechanically at scale, happen in the 1820s and the 1830s, right? Around the same time, this is where the work is being done. It's the Industrial Revolution is responsible for all of these things. Even though the idea of drying milk goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, it is specifically how do we do it at large scale, right? Which is part of the Industrial Revolution. The ability to pull a vacuum, a hard vacuum, is something that is new. It requires, machinery which is very, very precise to make the seals, to be able to pull that hard vacuum. Really, really important, set of intertwingled concepts, right? And so what we happen is we have in 1847 we have the Fry family in England, which appears to be the first to take some of the cocoa butter from the cocoa butter press and add it to the chocolate and sugar to make what I think is called the cream bar, right? Which went into serious production, I think, a decade after 1847, so maybe the late 1850s is when that happened. And then we have another nearly 20 years, 1850, nearly 20 years, right, between the invention of what we would first think of as the first dark chocolate bar into the first milk chocolate bar. And it is a combination of these technological developments, which are very tightly intertwingled, right, which need to happen in order for this stuff to happen. And so with all of that, with the invention of the dark chocolate bar, the cocoa butter press, alkalization, the dark chocolate bar, the milk chocolate bar, which is dependent upon figuring out a way to make chocolate crumb. And it turns out that, once the idea of chocolate crumb was around, right, within 20 years or so of the 1875, so within a decade or so of Daniel Peter introducing his milk chocolate bar, what we do is we find that Cadbury in England has got their, I think it's the Fry family that did it before Cadbury did it. And then Milton Hershey didn't introduce milk chocolate until actually 1900. And it was like, I thought it was a little earlier than that. And it turns out, no, it's not until actually the year 1900 that the milk chocolate bar, that the Hershey milk chocolate bar was invented. And that sort of makes some sense if he bought equipment during the Chicago Exposition in 1893. A lot of work to do in order to be able to figure out all this stuff. So it turns out that just somebody coming to me and saying, I didn't make any mistakes in my video, and doing some research on it, led to me sort of destroying, challenging, right? These are ideas that I've had in my head maybe for 20 years, right? And that if I look at them very closely, I find out that the things that I thought were true, were never true. And it wasn't until somebody called me out and said, I think you made a mistake, Clay, in saying that I made a mistake, right? I'm a historian. I'm a fact checker. Part of her job is to do that work, that I didn't make any mistake here. So did Daniel Peter invent milk chocolate? The answer is, he was the first person to release it. There are very few inventions in this world that don't rely on other things. So I would say that the process of making chocolate crumb, which led to the ability to manufacture milk chocolate, was a co-invention of Henri Nestle and Daniel Peter. And so we need to figure out what that means, right, in terms of how we're going to attribute the invention of milk chocolate. So Daniel Peter didn't do it on his own. He struggled for years to figure out how to do it, right? And it was with the assistance of Henri Nestle, after the successful commercial introduction of farine lactée, right, that Daniel Peter figured out a process for making milk chocolate crumb, which is a part of how milk chocolate is made today, or chocolate crumb, which is part of how milk chocolate is made today, right? And that for me is what I wanted to say about the importance of fact checking. Number one, is that I, right, as somebody who puts stuff out there, number one, I need to do my homework. And 20 years ago, maybe this information was quite as widely available, or it was much harder to get. It was in book form. It may have been in research libraries. It wasn't, on Google Scholar. It wasn't, weren't all these research tools 20 years ago that were available to me. And I never thought to go and re-examine what I thought were well-established histories. And it wasn't until I got called out that I had to go and do the research, do more research, and say, okay, where is the consensus? So the consensus seemed to be about Conrad van Houten inventing the cocoa butter press, but there were enough sources that I went to that said, no, it's not Conrad, it's his father, Kasparis. And we know it's 1828, even if we don't have any surviving patent drawings, right? And Conrad appears to have patented the alkalization process, but we don't know exactly when. Late 1830s is about as precise as most places will go. 1828, 1829 seems to be the consensus around what's going on. But I had ideas about what all this meant, and the timing about what it meant. And if I go back through writing about that I've done, I'll say, man, it's like I was wrong about all these things, right? And so I do want to say thank you to Ms. Pucciarelli, who came to me and said, I think you got these things wrong, right? And to say, yeah, I had some of these things wrong in my brain, right? And I'm going mea culpa. Thank you very much for triggering me to go and do this research. Right, to be able to get to some important new discoveries for myself, and I'm going to own up to it. My fault, right? That I didn't question, right? What I had learned, or what I had read, or what I made up in my brain from, trying to integrate 3 or 4 or 5 different sources, right? So again, my bad. But I also, in the process of doing this, think that some of the representations that were made in that TED Ed video, again, it's a TED Ed video. Can we try to do a history of chocolate and get it, absolutely correct in a very, very short, it's concise thing? The answer is no. I mean, somewhere in the script writing process, you're going to elide, or you're going to overlook some things for the purpose of the narrative, right? And so it works both ways, right? So I hope what you'll do is you'll take away from this, number one, is that I need to be prepared. You need to be prepared. We all need to be prepared to admit that we got it wrong, right? I try my very best to get it right, and I make mistakes. All of us make mistakes, right? When somebody comes and calls you out and says, maybe you made a mistake, you need to go with all humility, be able to say, yeah, maybe I made a mistake, and be willing to go through the research. For me, this issue about the cocoa butter press and powdered milk and the invention of milk chocolate, as I said, it got me into a discussion in my own brain about this portmanteau word that I thought I had created, intertwingle, and understand all of the connections. I mean, I've spent, at least 10 hours, if not longer, in this discussion in about a week, which is a lot of time to go think about this, because it turns out that it's really, really important to me. And I want to let you know, right, that it's important to me, and why I think it should be important to all of us. And with that, we're almost at the end of the hour. I thought this was going to be a short video today. I didn't think it would go this long, but if you're out there and you're watching, are there any topics, any ideas that you've held in your mind that you learned, right, after additional research or somebody calling out to you, that you learned were wrong, right? That you thought something was this way and it turned out to be a very different way. Now, if you put this in the comments, whether you're watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook during the episode, great. If you put them in after the episode is over, or if you are a member of the Chocolate Life, you can go to this page, the importance of fact checking. You can go to this post, not this post, but this post, right? And what you can do is you can go down to the bottom, and if you're a member, there's a member discussion, and you can say, hey, Clay, here are some ideas that I got wrong, right? And I learned different. Or, hey, Clay, here are some things I think I know, right? What do you think? I mean, do I have it right or do I have it wrong? I want to engage in a conversation with all of you who are interested in engaging in this conversation about the importance of fact checking and fact checking things that we just take for granted, right, as being true because, we read it secondhand or third hand in this book and we don't remember what the primary sources are. And here's another thing. If you have better primary sources for any of the things that I mentioned today, and you can say, hey, Clay, whatever you presented, in this episode, you're still wrong because it's different, right? The history of this is different. I'm looking at, primary sources that I can go to that I can say, these are authoritative, right? I can rely on them. And so when I talk about them, what I can say, here is what I believe, right? Here's what I think is the real story, right? The true story, right? And here are the sources that you can look at, right? In order to be able to go and determine, right? For yourself, whether you think, I'm full of it or not, or whether I'm talking about the truth. And because it's really important that we do that. Very, very important that you do it. It is, maybe I'm a little harsh in terms of the way. So, my article, my little post that I did, my tone was referred to as being snarky. Maybe I was snarky, right? Challenging, certainly, but part of the challenge is I want you, right, to fact check me. I want you to say, hey, Clay, I think you're wrong, right? And here's why I think you're wrong. If you think I'm wrong and you've got a primary source or you can point me to someplace, I am happy to say, I got this wrong, right? I am not invested in holding on to a particular viewpoint that turns out to be incorrect. Right? I want to make sure that when I get out there, I can confidently talk to people about what I know and why I know it and where my sources are. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. I wanted to share with you, my investigation of who invented the cocoa butter press, right? Who invented powdered milk, who invented the crumb process, and how did milk chocolate get invented? That's where I wanted to start. And then it ended up taking me down this memory lane exploration of this portmanteau word, intertwingled, which I did not know had anything to do with it. Well, I did not know would have anything to do. When I started out, I didn't know that the two were related. They were completely serendipitous as far as I was concerned. And the two were not unrelated. But it turns out that, learning about the history of these topics in chocolate caused me to think twice about, did I invent this word or not? Right. And I learned not only did I not invent the word, so this term, this portmanteau, intertwingle, but I have a connection to the person who did coin the word. And it's a deep connection to, my childhood and the early part of my career before I got into chocolate. And for that, I am incredibly thankful, right, for Ms. Pucciarelli, right, who came to me and said, I think you misrepresented my work. And I have to say thank you. It's been a fabulous journey for me, and I hope I'm right. And if I'm not right, tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me where I'm wrong, and I will be happy to change my tune. Right. And for me, I think that's the object lesson. If you are an academic, right, you've got a P. I don't have advanced degrees in chocolate. I don't have advanced degrees in historian. I don't have an advanced degree in medical history. I don't have an advanced degree. I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in photography. What I do have, right, is I've been working at these ideas and been a professional communicator around complex topics, initially in computer graphics, and then into chocolate, dating back to about 1984. So I've been doing this now for 40 years, right? And so my investment is not in any particular version of the story, but in actually getting the stories right. That is, the overarching aspect of my career over the course of the last 40 years that I see as a storyteller who takes complex topics and tries to communicate about them, not only but clearly, not necessarily concisely, right? But clearly, right? And then being able to talk about what is in fact um, factually correct. I was going to say the truth of the matter. I think that factually correct is a better way to think about it. And trying to understand the nuance that not all situations lend themselves to very, very simple and very, very straightforward answers. There is, in fact, a lot of nuance in a lot of these answers. And part of the challenge is you have different people who come to you with different levels of understanding and different levels of um, educational background and different levels of interest. And what you need to do is you need to find different ways of talking to people, right, in order to be able to help communicate what you communicate the story. And that's one of the reasons why this exploration this week has been so useful and so helpful and so interesting for me. And I hope it's been interesting for you as well, right? And let me know in the comments. And with that, I'm going to sign out by saying this episode of Pod Safe Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Safe Chocolate, is in fact sponsored by the members of the Chocolate Life. If you're not a member of the Chocolate Life, go click on a green button up here. It says account, I'm logged in. Or what you can do is you'll have this little avatar in the lower right-hand corner. It'll just say plus or join or something like that. If you're not logged in, become a member. There's always a free tier. There's special members-only content, member newsletters, right, that the general public don't have a chance to participate in. If you do join in and support financially, then there are tiers which include coaching and consulting, where you can ask me any question you want, and I will answer those questions for you. And with that, if you're watching, thumbs up on the video, subscribe to the channel, share with friends to grow the community. And with that, I will sign out because we're almost at the end of the hour with the way I try to close every episode, which is I hope you get the idea that I'm having fun doing this, that I enjoy it. Even when somebody says, Clay, you're wrong, the challenge, the intellectual challenge of finding out what the right answer is, a good answer is, communicating answers, are processes that I find fun. And so if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you are in fact doing it wrong. Until the next time, everybody.